Two riders found her on a cold February morning. They weren't looking for anything. They were on a trail ride near the fairgrounds. Horses, pine trees, gray winter light. And then a girl, lying in the woods, and nothing in Covington, Louisiana was ever quite the same. She was 16 years old. Her name was Roxanne Sharp, and for 44 years, the question of what happened to her sat in a case file, in a freezer, in the memory of a shrinking number of people who refused to forget. Detectives came and went. A hurricane drowned the evidence room. A famous serial killer confessed and was lying. The people who knew the truth stayed silent for 4 decades. Then, in 2025, a local radio executive sat down in front of a microphone and asked one question. Who killed Roxanne Sharp? 14 months later, 4 men were in handcuffs. This is the story of a girl her own town barely mourned, a cold case that outlived most of her family, and the podcast that finally made people talk. Stay with me, because the way this case broke open says something about small towns, about silence, and about how long the truth can wait. To understand what happened to Roxanne, you have to understand Covington, Louisiana, in the winter of 1982. Covington sits about 30 miles north of New Orleans, across the long causeway over Lake Pontchartrain, up in St. Tammany Parish, where the land turns to piney woods, and the towns get small and everybody knows everybody. This was the North Shore, close enough to New Orleans that people could feel the city's pull, far enough away that they believed its troubles stayed on the other side of the lake. In 1982, gas was about $1.30 a gallon. Ronald Reagan was a year into his first term. Families gathered around console televisions in the evening, and in a parish like St. Tammany, the local radio station was still how you learned what was happening in your own town. Covington itself was the kind of place where a murder was front-page news, because there hadn't been one in 2 years. Think about that number. 2 full years without a single killing. People left doors unlocked. Kids rode bikes until the streetlights came on. On winter weekends, riders saddled up for trail rides through the parish, hundreds of horses moving down country roads and forest trails. A Louisiana tradition that went back generations, part parade, part family reunion. The smell of pine and horses and wood smoke. That was the Covington most people knew. But every small town has a part of itself it doesn't talk about. In Covington, people called it the ozone. It was a rough patch of the community where, by many accounts, gangs gathered, drugs moved, and trouble found the people who lived near it. If you grew up around the ozone, you learned 2 things early. You learned how to survive, and you learned to keep your mouth shut. Roxanne Sharp learned both. She was 16, and her life had already been harder than most people's ever get. She'd grown up in a tough home near the ozone. Police knew her name. She'd been arrested for fights, for property damage, and she used drugs. On paper, she was the kind of victim whose case gets a paragraph in the newspaper and then goes quiet. But the people who actually knew Roxanne described someone else entirely. They described a friendly girl, a resourceful girl, a survivor, someone who had adapted to circumstances no child should have to adapt to, and who kept going anyway. And Roxanne wasn't just a teenager. She was a mother. She had a baby boy, 18 months old. Whatever else was true about her life, that little boy was in it. She was 16 years old, raising a son, surviving a neighborhood that ate people alive. And in the early weeks of 1982, something was weighing on her. Her mother noticed it. Roxanne seemed upset, genuinely shaken, about a friend who had overdosed around the ozone. Roxanne believed there might have been more to that death than an overdose. She hinted the friend may have been murdered, but she never explained. She never said who. She never said why. And then, in the second week of February, Roxanne Sharp disappeared. 3 days. That's how long she was gone. 3 days in which a 16-year-old girl was missing from a small Louisiana town, and no massive search shook the parish awake. Maybe it was because Roxanne had a record, and runaways with records don't trigger alarms. Maybe it was because girls from the Ozone went missing in ways that girls from the nicer streets did not. Whatever the reason, those 3 days passed quietly, and they would turn out to matter enormously. Then came the morning of February 12, 1982. A group was out on the Dixie Trail ride, moving through the woods near the St. Tammany Parish Fairgrounds, on the edge of town. 2 of the riders saw something off the trail. It was Roxanne. She was lying in the woods, naked, with a jacket thrown across her body. Her clothing wasn't with her. It was scattered, pieces of it strung along the trail, some of it 80 feet or more from where she lay. Investigators would determine she had been raped and then strangled. And she hadn't died there. Someone had killed her somewhere else and then carried or dragged her body into those woods and left her. The coroner estimated she'd been dead between 48 and 72 hours, which meant she was likely killed almost immediately after she went missing, while her family still thought she might walk back through the door. And here is the cruelest detail of that crime scene. There was evidence everywhere: clothing, physical traces, a trail of it. But in those 3 days, heavy Louisiana rain had swept through the parish, and that rain washed the scene almost clean. Clues that might have named a killer in a week were simply gone. The first murder in Covington in 2 years, a dead 16-year-old mother, and a crime scene the sky itself had helped erase. The investigation started the way small-town investigations do, with shoe leather. Covington police went door to door. They interviewed 150 people. They filled hundreds of pages with notes, names, timelines, rumors, and they ran, again and again, into a wall of silence. The Ozone did not talk to police. Not about this. Not about anything. Investigators could feel it in the interviews. People who clearly knew something and were clearly afraid. In a neighborhood that tight, everyone understood that the person you informed on might live 3 doors down. Fear kept mouths closed, and every closed mouth bought the killers another year. The FBI's Behavioral Science Unit, the famous profiling division, reviewed the case. Their conclusion was chilling in its specificity. They believed Roxanne had not been killed by a stranger passing through. They believed she was murdered by 2 or more people in a spur-of-the-moment attack. People she knew. Which meant her killers were probably still right there, in town, passing her family on the street. Then the case took a turn that damaged it for decades. Henry Lee Lucas, the one-eyed drifter who became infamous in the 1980s for confessing to hundreds of murders across America, claimed Roxanne's killing too. You have to understand what Lucas was in those years. Task forces flew him around the country. Departments with unsolved murders lined up to interview him. And Lucas, enjoying the attention and the special treatment, told them all exactly what they wanted to hear. Cases were closed on his word alone. It would be years before the scale of the deception came out. Most of his confessions were fabrications, one of the great investigative embarrassments in American law enforcement history. For Roxanne's case, the damage was simple and brutal. Investigators had chased a phantom, and the real trail cooled while they did. And there was one more shadow over Covington in those years. A local man named Robert Lee Willie, a name that would later become notorious as one of the killers whose crimes inspired the book and film Dead Man Walking, had been part of a 1980 murder spree that horrified the parish, including the killing of a Covington teenager named Faith Hathaway. Willie was known to hang around the ozone. His arrest, his trial, his death sentence, it consumed the region's attention, its headlines, its fear. St. Tammany Parish only had so much room for horror. And Roxanne's murder slipped further into the dark. Here's what that meant in practice. Within a couple of years, if you asked people in Covington about murdered girls, they'd tell you about Faith Hathaway. Roxanne Sharp, same town, same era, same rough orbit around the ozone, became a footnote in her own community. The FBI profile sat in the file, essentially a map pointing at the answer. Local, multiple offenders. People she knew. But a map is useless if nobody will walk it with you. The papers wrote almost nothing about who she was. There was no advocate, no crusading family spokesperson keeping her name in the news. Just a file, growing quieter every year. Before we go on, a quick word. Every case we cover on this channel is built from verified reporting, news archives, police statements, and on-the-record sources, and where a case is still moving through the courts. We tell you that plainly. If that's the kind of true crime you want more of, take a second to like this video and subscribe. And tell us in the comments where you're watching from. Now, back to Covington. The years did what years do. The case passed from Covington Police to the Louisiana State Police. Detectives retired. Witnesses moved away or died. And Roxanne's own family began to disappear too. Her niece would later describe the murder as a cloud that hung over all of them, a grief that never resolved because it never got an answer. One by one, the people who loved Roxanne passed away without ever knowing who killed her, including her son. The baby boy who was 18 months old when his mother was murdered, grew up, lived his life, and died, still without an answer. Think about that. The case went so cold, it outlived the victim's own child. And all through those years, science was advancing toward this case without anyone in Covington knowing it. In 1982, DNA identification didn't exist. The first criminal conviction using DNA evidence anywhere in the world was still 4 years away. But somebody in Louisiana had the foresight to preserve the biological evidence from Roxanne's crime scene, keeping it frozen, waiting. That evidence was a message in a bottle, thrown toward a future that might know how to read it. Then, in 2005, the case nearly died completely. Hurricane Katrina tore through Louisiana, and among everything else it destroyed, floodwaters reached evidence storage. Much of the DNA evidence in Roxanne's case, material kept frozen for more than 2 decades, waiting for science to catch up, was lost. 23 years of patience, drowned in a weekend. What survived was a fraction. Whether that fraction would ever be enough, nobody could say. But not everyone let go. At the Louisiana State Police, an investigator named Stephen Montgomery took ownership of the file. Montgomery didn't believe the comfortable theories. He didn't think Roxanne was killed by an outsider, and he didn't think it was an isolated act. He believed the FBI had been right all along, that the answer had always been local. His question was simpler and harder after all these years. Would anyone finally be willing to say what they knew? One of the officers who had carried this case through the decades didn't live to see that question answered. That's what a 44-year cold case really costs. It isn't just the victim, it's everyone who waits. By 2023, Montgomery and the state police's Covington office decided to try again, properly, from the ground up. They pulled the full case file, hundreds of pages of 40-year-old notes. They tracked down and re-interviewed old witnesses and old suspects, men and women now in their 60s, asking them to remember a February from another lifetime. And they took what physical evidence had survived Katrina and resubmitted it for DNA analysis. The technology of 2023 could pull usable profiles from samples that would have been hopeless even a decade earlier. Smaller, older, more degraded material than the original investigators could ever have imagined testing. The science was moving. But science alone couldn't solve this case. The FBI profile had said it from the beginning. The answer was in the community. Someone had to talk. By the 2020s, there was a new way to make that happen. One nobody in 1982 could have predicted. Across the country, true crime podcasts had started doing what decades of police work sometimes couldn't. A podcast called Your Own Backyard helped drive the case that finally convicted Kristen Smart's killer in California. Others surfaced witnesses, pressured re-investigations, kept forgotten names alive. Detectives had learned something important. Millions of people were listening, and some of those listeners knew things. And that's where a radio man enters the story. His name is Charles Dowdy, a vice president at North Shore Media Group, the company behind local radio in St. Tammany Parish. In 2024, doing interviews with law enforcement, Dowdy mentioned something almost in passing. He'd been thinking about producing a true crime podcast about a forgotten local case. Not long after, the state police came to him with a story. Her name was Roxanne Sharp. Understand what was unusual about this. Most true crime podcasts are made from the outside. Journalists and hobbyists working around law enforcement, sometimes against it. This one was different. The Louisiana State Police weren't tolerating the podcast. They were partners in it. They had a cold case that needed exactly one thing: for the community to start talking. And here was a trusted local voice. A man from North Shore Radio whose company had been in people's kitchens and truck cabs for years, offering to carry the question directly to the only audience that mattered. Dowdy spent months on it. He worked with state police investigators, NA experts, legal experts, even the mayor of Covington. He dug through the case's history and the history of the ozone itself, and he went out with detectives as they physically rewalked the crime scene, stretching measuring tapes through the woods to mark exactly where Roxanne was found and where each piece of evidence had been recovered 40 years earlier, recording it all for listeners, so that anyone in the parish could stand in that morning in February 1982 and feel what had been done there. On February 25th, 2025, the first episode of Who Killed Roxanne Sharp went out into the world. 6 weekly episodes. Her life, the ozone, the crime scene, the investigation that stalled, and at the end of every episode, the same request: if you know anything, no matter how small, no matter how old, come forward. Dowdy admitted later that when they started, they half expected silence. They thought nobody cared. They were wrong almost immediately. People remembered Roxanne. People who'd been her friends. People who'd grown up around the ozone and carried what they knew for 40 years. The tips started coming in from the very first episodes, more than anyone expected. A state police spokesperson later said the podcast became the turning point. It let investigators finally reconstruct Roxanne's final days, hour by hour, place by place. And it brought forward witnesses they never knew existed. Even Montgomery was stunned by one thing. Women were still alive, right there in the parish, who said they had been raped in Covington around that same era and had never been heard. Decades of silence, breaking all at once. The wall the ozone had built in 1982 was finally coming down. And behind it, investigators were assembling a case. The old evidence, retested with modern DNA methods. the old files, cross-referenced with new statements. 14 months of quiet, methodical work. Then came April 2026, 44 years, 2 months, and 1 week after 2 trail riders found a girl in the woods. On April 21st, officers moved. In Covington, they arrested 62-year-old Billy Williams, Jr. The same day, agents in Dayton, Ohio, arrested 64-year-old Darrell Dean Spell at his home to be extradited back to Louisiana. And the next day, detectives made contact with 2 more men, Perry Wayne Taylor and Carlos Cooper, both 64, who were already sitting in Louisiana prisons on entirely unrelated charges. 4 men, all in their 60s now, all from Covington. All, according to investigators, connected to the ozone or to the circle around Robert Lee Willie. All of them teenagers or young men in 1982, the same era as Roxanne. All 4 were charged with aggravated rape and second-degree murder. If any of them is convicted, the sentence is life in prison. And it has to be said clearly, because this is where responsible true crime draws the line. These men are accused. They have been charged, not convicted. Each of them is presumed innocent, unless and until a jury says otherwise. One of the men's sons has publicly insisted his father is innocent and would never hurt anyone. That is what trials are for, and this case is now headed to one. But for the investigators, for the town, and for what remains of Roxanne's family, April 24, 2026, was a day none of them thought they'd see. At a press conference in St. Tammany Parish, officials stood before cameras and said out loud what had been unthinkable for 44 years. Arrests had been made in the murder of Roxanne Sharp. The district attorney called it proof of what persistence, collaboration, and modern investigative technology can accomplish, and a message that his office would pursue justice no matter how much time had passed. The Covington police chief put it in plainer words. Cold cases, he said, don't close themselves. They close because people show up, year after year, and refuse to quit. And everyone in that room acknowledged the strange modern truth at the center of it. A local podcast had helped crack a 1982 murder. Not by naming a suspect, by doing something older than any technology, telling the town a story about one of its own and asking people to finally speak. Roxanne Sharp would be 60 years old now. Old enough to be a grandmother. Old enough, maybe, to have finally gotten free of the ozone, the way survivors sometimes do. The friendly, resourceful girl her friends remembered never got the chance to become anyone at all. She never got to see her son grow up. He never got answers while he lived. Most of the family that mourned her is gone. Whatever a jury ultimately decides about the 4 men now awaiting trial, nothing hands back the 44 years this case took. But something did change. On February 12, 2026, 44 years to the day since those riders found her in the woods, Charles Dowdy released a new episode of the podcast, marking the anniversary. He said he isn't finished, and that if the podcast accomplished nothing else, it did one thing that mattered. It brought Roxanne back into the light. For 4 decades, she was a paragraph, a file in a flooded evidence room, a name that stayed inside Covington and never made it past the parish line. Now her story has been heard by people all over the world, and, prosecutors believe, it shook loose the truth. There's a lesson buried in this case, and it isn't really about Dina or podcasts. It's about silence. In 1982, fear kept an entire neighborhood quiet, and that quiet lasted longer than most of the people it protected. What broke it, in the end, was somebody caring enough to ask, publicly, patiently, episode after episode, and ordinary people deciding, 40 years late, that a 16-year-old girl mattered more than an old secret. Somewhere in your town, there's probably a case like Roxanne's, a name the older folks remember and the younger ones never learned. If this story proves anything, it's that those cases are not hopeless. Memories last. Evidence waits. And sometimes all it takes is one person with a microphone and one listener who finally picks up the phone. The trial of the 4 accused men lies ahead, and we'll follow it. If you want to see how this case ends and hear more true stories like it, told straight from the record, subscribe and turn on notifications. If you knew Covington in those years, or you remember Roxanne, the comments are yours. Her name was Roxanne Sharp. She was 16. And after 44 years, her town is finally talking. Thanks for watching.